So if you've looked at the portion for this week, very exciting. We have the excitement of the Exodus narrative, and then all of a sudden we get into construction details, like how many dolphin skins, because dolphins are readily available in the desert, do you need to build the Mishkan, and exactly how much acacia wood and blue and purple and crimson yarn is needed for the decorating of the Mishkan. Again, they were just enslaved 3 seconds before in the previous page. But I think the answer to why are we reading about the focus and the details of the building of the tabernacle in the desert comes in the verse where it says, Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, and let them make me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them. Because what does it mean that they're building a sanctuary? They're stating a fact that God is not in the heavens far away, that God has not abandoned them, nor will he or she or they, but God will live very much in a very tangible, real, physical sense in a home among them. And the people respond with such excitement that they can't stop themselves from oversharing of all of their gifts. It's like a bonanza. But what happens when time passes is that the ark goes from this movable item into this thing that's found inside of brick. It becomes permanent. The tent becomes stone. The portable sanctuary becomes the great temple on Mount Moriah. And we even hear the tension between the movable to the static in the prayer that King Solomon says. But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less the house that I have built? Solomon is directly naming the paradox. How is a great God going to reside in something as teeny small as a little temple on Mount Moriah? Well, that's where faith comes in, or so we're told. The temple, as we all know, burns and is destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. And next we find Ezekiel, who's also discussing where God's going to dwell. He describes it in great detail in his book, in fact, in his imagining of what's going to happen in the future. He offers this image of a temple that's rebuilt, reconstructed, but in such a way that the kavod of God, the honor or the glory, which for the biblical authors was a tangible, physical thing, would also reside among us. Ezekiel's temple is a temple of hope. It carried in the heart when nothing is left standing. It's both portable, it's imaginary, and it's full of this desire of what will happen when the Israelites are, in his mind, welcomed back to their homeland. Well, the effect of what he did was he kept the blueprint alive. I'm not saying that the Israelites used that when they constructed the second temple, but let's imagine that parts of it were definitely present, as archaeologists have noted. After the destruction, though, of the second temple by the Romans in the year 70 CE, the rabbis then faced the same question. Where does God's presence go when the building is gone? The answer, of course, and the question are both challenging theologically, and the answer must be pragmatic. The answer that it becomes a Mishkan Me'at, a small sanctuary in the form of the thing that we are currently residing in, a synagogue. We are a teeny fraction of that Mishkan. That's why there's the light and the ark and all the accoutrements on the Torah, which, well, the priests once wore those items. When we think about it, though, when it's not just the physicalness of the items that make it secret, it's the fact that when you have 10 Jews coming together, you have to, that's what's necessary to have prayer. You can't just pray solo. I mean, you can, but for it to be halachically sound, you have to have 10 Jews. The rabbis also say that when 2 Jews come together and study, the Shekhinah comes down and dwells among them. Again, playing off this idea that there's a sacredness to being present in community, not just in structure, but in act that we're actually doing. And I want you to consider something surprising or thoughtful about the architecture. If you look around, we have odes on our walls to columns. We have a dome overhead. Why? Because these are items that when we think about what does it mean to have a sacred building, well, some of these things are present, including stained glass windows, which carry narrative. I want you to ask yourself, or I want to ask you, what other buildings have those similar structures? The answer that came in my mind was the United Nations, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, monuments will frequently have those same structures because we, when we created this society, believed that our democracy was going to live in some liminal space between separation of church and state. The democracy that we run is by the people, for the people, and the buildings that I'm speaking of, well, they're not synagogues or churches, and yet they can contain, in some ways, the very fragments of the sacred. The interior spaces of those buildings are designed to inspire awe of power. And when you find yourself, if you've ever walked through the Capitol, there's a low hum, that's found in there. When you go to war memorials, like the Vietnam Memorial in DC, you'll see people have left wreaths and pictures of their loved ones. They're not treated as a simple thing. They're recognized as something more than that, as something sacred. The architects of these structures explicitly drew upon religious traditions focusing on transcendence. And the question that tradition then presses us to ask is this: can the kavod of God actually fill a building that's raised or created not necessarily for worship, but for governance, not for prayer, but for diplomacy? And when I think about that, I think about and remember that there is an answer in my mind of a conditional yes. The Mishkan was built not by the priests, rather it was built by artisans. It was built by Bezalel and Oholib, who were wise of heart in their construction. And it was funded by all of us, Israelites, who did so with free, willing offerings as a whole people. And its holiness, well, that's derived through its construction, but also through its treatment. We treat it as a special place. When Amos, Isaiah, and Micah challenged Israel's complacency, they didn't attack the temple, they attacked the gap rather between the sacred and the street. God had no desires for your burnt offerings, all three prophets preach, when you trample the poor on your way into the temple. The holiness of the sacred space is hollow, but only if we treat it as such. When those institutions fall short, though, when the Capitol is desecrated, when the UN fails to prevent genocide, when tradition gives us a name for that, it's actually called Chilul Hashem, to profane God's name. And in a way, we look at those sacred spaces with those references back to religious architecture, and of course ask, are we profaning God's name in them ever? This Shabbat, I want to invite you, to sit with the ark of what we have traced, all the way from the Mishkan in the desert, the portable, beloved, extravagant, well, kind of cool tent, to the temple on the mount, to Ezekiel's vision in exile, to the Mikdash Ma'at, the synagogue like ours, to the great civic buildings of our age. And what connects it all, I think, is this human aching for connection and longing to build a space where distance between heaven and earth might, just for a brief moment, be narrowed. And here, I think, is what tradition insists, even in the voice of King Solomon himself, who offered doubt, that longing itself is a holy act, that the building toward something greater is itself an act of faith. We don't build because it's an attempt according to this idea, to contain the divine. We build because we believe the divine is real and that our reaching out matters. It's not always, sometimes the cloud that we have created, forgive me, we build because we believe the divine is real and that our reaching matters. And that sometimes, not always, sometimes the cloud settles on what we have made, the cloud of God. We are still building, of course, synagogues are still happening. We're fixing up our lovely home that was constructed in 1902. But we raise up sacred spaces and we invite God to come and dwell among us. And sometimes, unfortunately, the structure does betray the vision, but sometimes it holds a blueprint, like Ezekiel described, of what could be. And that invitation of connection doesn't expire. V'shachanti b'tochem, I dwell among them, not among the cedar beams or behind the veil, among them, among us, God would say. And that promise is still open. On this Shabbat, in this place, we are part of the long human answer to that connection.